The morning she unloaded the first bare root stalk onto ground that hadn't grown anything taller than poverty grass in 20 years. It was a Tuesday in early April of 2003, and the sky was the color of old pewter pressing down low over the ridgeline. She had 200 bundles of berry root seedlings in the bed of a flatbed she'd borrowed from her uncle, and the seedlings were wrapped in damp burlap, the way you'd wrap something you weren't sure would survive the trip. The elevation up there was 2,200 feet. The soil pH, according to the last test she'd run in October of 2002, was sitting at 4.1, which is the kind of number that stops a conversation at the extension office rather than starts one. There was a man from the county's Soil and Water Conservation District who had driven up that same week, not to help her, but to be certain she understood what she was dealing with. He had a clipboard. He had columns. He had that particular look that well-meaning people carry when they've already decided the answer and are only present out of professional courtesy. He walked about 40 feet out onto the bench, looked down at the gray-orange spoil material showing through where the frost had heaved the thin cover, and he looked back at her and said the land had been compacted to a depth of roughly 30 inches in the worst sections, that the organic matter was testing below 0.5%, and that he'd seen reclamation projects on ground like this take 20 years to establish even a marginal canopy. She thanked him for coming. He drove back down the access road in a truck that still had the dealer sticker shine on it, and she stood there, on 2,200 acres of what the deed described as reclaimed surface mine land, and she looked out at all of it, and she did not feel discouraged. I want to be honest about why that is, because it matters to the rest of this story. She was not a reckless person, or a romantic one. She had grown up on that ridge. She had watched the mining operation come in when she was 11 years old in 1974, and she had watched it leave when she was 20 in 1983, and she had stood on this same bench at various points in the 20 years since and watched the land try to remember what it used to be. She knew what the extension man knew, and she also knew something he didn't, which was that her grandmother had grown chestnuts on this same ridge before the mining began, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, and that the native chestnut, before the blight of 1904 came through and took most of it, had been the single most important mast tree in the eastern highlands, the one that fed everything from bear to deer to the communities of people who lived under them. She had not come up here with a clipboard. She had come up here with her grandmother's notebook. The notebook was a composition book with a black and white marbled cover, the corners worn soft as old chamois, and her grandmother had kept it in the drawer of a writing desk that had since passed to her mother and then to her, and she had not opened it seriously, not with the intention of reading it through, until the winter of 2001, when she was sitting in the farmhouse at the bottom of the ridge, with the heat running and the snow coming sideways past the window, and she had pulled it out and set it on the kitchen table and read it cover to cover for the first time since she'd been a girl, turning pages out of curiosity rather than purpose. Her grandmother had kept the notebook between 1961 and 1978, and it was not a diary in any personal sense. It was a record dates of first frost and last frost, going back to borrowed memory from her own mother. Rainfall measured in a coffee can on the porch railing. Notes on which trees bore in which years and which did not, and what the weather had been in the spring preceding the good years. Notes on soil she'd amended with lime and how many years it took to show in the crop. There were drawings of leaves, careful and small, and there were rows of numbers that took some interpretation, and there was one page near the back, dated September of 1972, 2 years before the mining company arrived, that had a line near the bottom that was underlined twice, with a pencil that had pressed hard enough to score the paper beneath. The line read, "Good ground runs deeper here than anyone has bothered to check. 50 feet back from the old spring seep, the dirt changes, and I believe the old trees knew it." There was nothing after it on that page. The next entry was from March of 1973, and it was about frost dates again, as though her grandmother had written the line, set the pencil down, and decided to let it sit until she had more to say about it, and she never did. Because the survey crews came in the summer of 1973, and the mining permits followed, and whatever her grandmother had been thinking about that ground and that spring seep and what the old trees had known about it was overtaken by events, and the notebook went into the drawer, and her grandmother died in 1991. And the notebook passed to her mother and then to her, and she had carried that underlined line in the back of her mind for 2 years, before she came up the ridge in April of 2003 with 200 bundles of Barrow chestnut stock and borrowed a flatbed and started planting. By noon that day, the version of the story circulating at the diner in town had her planting 5,000 trees on a pile of old mine spoil, which was not far wrong. Only the 5,000 would take 2 more springs to finish, and the diner's version had her doing it in a single morning, which is the speed at which borrowed stories prefer to travel. She planted 840 trees that first April, working with 2 hired hands, a man named Arvin, who had worked reclamation seeding for the mining company in the 1982nd and knew how to read compacted ground, and a younger man, her neighbor's son, who worked hard and asked good questions and didn't complain about the slope. They used a modified dibble bar on the softer sections and a 2-man auger on the sections where the compaction was bad, and they planted at a spacing of 12 feet by 12 feet, which gave her a density of roughly 300 trees per acre on the section she started with. And she was working from a plan she had drawn out on graph paper over the winter, a grid that respected the old spring seep her grandmother had mentioned, leaving a buffer around it, placing the densest planting on the bench and the upper slopes where the aspect was east-facing and the frost drainage was better. She had sourced her seedlings from 2 suppliers, one in Pennsylvania and one in western North Carolina, and she had chosen a blight-resistant hybrid stock that had been developed through a breeding program she had read about in an agricultural journal in the late 1992. A program that was crossing the American chestnut's form and cold tolerance with the disease resistance of the Chinese chestnut, and she had corresponded by letter, actual handwritten letters sent in envelopes, with the man running that program, and he had been patient with her questions and honest about what was still uncertain. Because this was 2002, and the program was still young, and nobody knew yet whether the hybrid would perform at commercial scale or at high elevation, or on ground that had been as thoroughly disrupted as strip-mined Appalachian spoil. She knew it was a bet. She had bet before. The first time she planted the bench, in April of 2003, and then again in April of 2004, and again in 2005, adding sections each time, so that by the end of the spring planting of 2005, she had put 5,216 trees in the ground across approximately 17 acres of the most workable portion of the bench and the upper east slope, and she had lost roughly 300 of them by then to frost heave and to deer browse in the first 2 winters, before she got the tube guards up properly, and she had replaced most of those, and she had kept a notebook of her own through all of it, a spiral bound with a red cover, which she recorded what she had planted, and where and when, and what had died, and why she thought it had died. And she noted the soil temperatures at planting depth in the 3 sections she could reach with the probe she'd bought second-hand from a retired agronomist who'd been cleaning out his shop. And she noted the date of first leaf out in each section, and the date of first burr formation beginning in year 4. And she worked the notebook the way her grandmother had worked hers, which is to say carefully and without assumption. The extension man came back in the spring of 2006. A different man from the same office, younger, with a newer clipboard and the same polite certainty. He walked the planting on the bench, and he counted canopy closure in the sections that were 3 years old, and he told her the survival rate on reclaimed mine spoil at this elevation typically ran between 40 and 60% at the 5-year mark. She had her own numbers by then. She was running at 71% survival across the full planting, and higher than that, closer to 78%, on the east-facing bench sections where the frost drainage was better. She showed him her red notebook. He looked at the columns for a moment, nodded with the careful nod of someone recalibrating, and said that was better than he'd expected for this elevation and this substrate. She thanked him for coming. He drove back down the road. she went back to the bench. By 2007, the oldest section of the planting was showing canopy closure in the densest rows, and she had her first meaningful burr crop in 2008, which was 5 years after the first planting, which is on the early end of what the literature suggests for this type of hybrid on marginal ground. And she believed the east-facing aspect and the drainage from the spring seep were doing some of what her grandmother had suspected they would do, feeding the roots, something the spoil alone could not provide, though she was careful in her notebook not to claim more than she could measure. That same year, 2008, she had her first conversation with a processor, a man who ran a small specialty foods operation out of a town 40 minutes south of the ridge, who had been buying European chestnuts through an importer for years and had told her 3 years earlier when she first contacted him that he'd be interested if she ever had volume. He came up the ridge in October of 2008 and walked the bearing section of the planting with her, and she watched him move through the rows, stopping at intervals, picking up a burr, working it open with his thumb, looking at the nut inside. He was a quiet man by nature, not one who filled silences with reassurance. He walked to the end of the row and turned around and came back, and he stood at the edge of the planting where it met the unplanted spoil grass, and he looked out at the bearing section for a long moment without saying anything, and then he said one word. He said, "Consistent." He said it the way a man says a word when he means something larger than the word itself, and she understood him, because consistency in a chestnut crop is a harder thing to achieve than volume. And consistency is what a processor needs to build a product line around, and she had it, or the beginning of it. And they shook hands at the top of the road that day and worked out a first arrangement for the 2008 harvest, which ran to approximately 9,000 pounds of clean-shelled nut, which was modest, but it was real, and it was consistent, and it was the first money the Ridge had made in 25 years. I need to slow down here and say something about what the land itself was doing through all of this, because the land is not a passive thing in this story. And if you've spent any time on reclaimed mine ground, you will know that it does not come back the way you plan for it to come back. It comes back the way it wants to. And your job is to pay enough attention to read what it's telling you and adjust. What she was noticing from about 2006 onward and recording carefully in the red notebook was that the trees were not behaving uniformly across the planting. The section on the far east end of the bench, the 50 or 60 feet back from the old spring seep that her grandmother had mentioned, was doing something the other sections weren't doing. The trees there were larger, not dramatically, not in a way that would stop you in your tracks in year 3 or even year 5, but in a way that accumulated, so that by 2009, the trees in that section were measurably ahead of the adjacent planting by an average of 14 inches in trunk diameter at 4 feet of height, and they were bearing a year earlier than the trees 30 feet away on the same bench, and the burr load per tree in that section was running roughly a third heavier than the average across the rest of the planting. She had pulled soil samples from that section and compared them to samples from the adjacent areas in 2007, and the lab results had shown a higher calcium reading and a slightly elevated organic matter percentage, still low, in absolute terms, still under 2%, but higher than the spoil material 30 feet away. And she had written in the notebook in her careful hand, "Old ground persists." She had underlined it once, not twice, because she was a careful person and she did not want to claim more than she had proven. But she was thinking about her grandmother's line. She was thinking about the deep good ground her grandmother believed ran back from the seep. She was thinking that the mining operation had taken the surface but might not have taken everything, that somewhere below the compacted spoil layer there was a profile that predated the disturbance, and that the trees with their deep taproot architecture might be reaching it. She didn't say this to anyone for 2 years. Sad. She thought about it during the harvest, and she thought about it during the winter. And she pulled the red notebook out more than once and looked at the numbers from that east section. And she sat with the question the way her grandmother had apparently sat with it, not forcing it, waiting for the land to offer more before she asked it directly. The difference between a problem and a lesson, her grandmother had written once in the front of the notebook, is only whether you were paying attention when it happened to you. She hired a soil scientist in the spring of 2011. He was a man who worked out of a university about 90 miles away, semi-retired, with a reputation for being honest about what he didn't know, which is a rarer quality in a scientist than it ought to be. She had written to him after finding a paper he'd published in 1998 on residual soil profiles under Appalachian surface mine reclamation, a paper that asked whether the stripping and spoil replacement process had in some cases inadvertently protected a buried profile rather than destroyed it. The paper was careful and hedged and made no strong claims, but it had asked the question, and asking the question carefully was enough for her. He came up the ridge on a Tuesday in May of 2011, which was 8 years after she'd first put trees in the ground, and he brought a hydraulic soil probe that could reach 60 inches of depth, and he spent the better part of 2 days on the east section and the adjacent areas, pulling cores at intervals she'd marked out with stakes, logging each one in his own field notebook, not saying much. On the second afternoon, he pulled a core at about 50 feet back from the spring seep in the densest part of the superior performing section, and he pulled it up and stood there looking at it for a long time, long enough that she walked over to where he was standing, and she looked at what he was looking at. Below the compacted spoil layer, which ran to about 28 inches at that location, the core was showing something different. The spoil gave way to a transition zone and then to what he said was a remnant A horizon, a fragment of the original topsoil profile that had been buried by the spoil replacement rather than removed, and below that a B horizon in a clay loam matrix that was reddish-brown and structurally intact and unlike anything in the disturbed material above it. He held the core tube in both hands in the afternoon light, and he turned it slowly. And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said the word substantial. He said it softly, the way the processor had said consistent 3 years earlier, as though the finding required a measured voice to honor it properly. The buried profile ran, as best he could determine over the 2 days of coring, across an area of approximately 2.5 acres in the east section, the same 50 feet back from the seep that her grandmother had penciled into the notebook in September of 1972, the same ground the old trees had known about. The ground that had persisted 30 feet below the spoil, while everything above it was stripped and replaced and left to recover on its own terms. The trees she had planted over that section were rooting into an original Appalachian soil profile that was, by his estimate, somewhere between 80 and 120 years old at its youngest preserved layer. Rich with the iron and calcium and biological structure that the old chestnut forest had built over generations before. The blight and the mines had come through. The trees were not just surviving the ridge. They were remembering it. By the time the offer came, it was the late summer of 2019, and the planting was 16 years old in its oldest sections, and the surviving stand had matured into something that took your breath if you came up the ridge at first light on an October morning and walked into it, the way the canopy had closed over the rows, the way the burr crop hung in the outer branches, the way the light came through in long angles, and the whole bench smelled of leaf damp and something sweeter underneath it that you could not quite name. She was running between 60 and 70,000 pounds of clean-shelled nut per hour harvest season by 2017, with the east section contributing a disproportionate share of the premium-grade fruit, the largest and most consistent nuts going to the specialty processor, and by that point, to 2 restaurant supply buyers she had developed relationships with over several years of careful and patient correspondence. The operation was profitable. Not extravagantly, not in a way that made news, but consistently profitable, which is a harder thing to achieve and a more reliable thing to build on than any single extraordinary year. The offer came through a land and timber acquisition firm operating on behalf of a buyer it declined to name initially, and the figure in the letter was $9 million for the full 2,200 acres, the standing timber, the chestnut planting, and the mineral rights. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her coffee going cold beside her. She set it down. She picked up the red notebook, and she turned to the harvest records for 2017 and 2018 and she did the arithmetic she had done before. The arithmetic she had been doing in her head for 2 years with a longer horizon in view, the numbers around what the east section was capable of when it reached full maturity, and what the full planting might do at 25 years, and what a consistent premium chestnut operation of that scale, on ground with a buried soil profile of that quality, was worth to someone who understood what it was. And she set the red notebook down next to the acquisition letter, and she looked at the two of them side by side for a while. Then she called the neighbor whose son had helped plant that first year in 2003. His son was in his mid-30s now and had been working the harvest operation with her for the last 4 seasons. She told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her a question that she said later was the question that mattered. He asked her whether the man making the offer understood what was in the ground under the east section, or whether he was buying 2,200 acres of reclaimed spoil with a chestnut planting on it, and she said she didn't know. And he said that seemed like a thing worth knowing before she answered. She put the letter in a drawer, and she called the soil scientist who was fully retired by then, but still took her calls, and she asked him what his documentation of the buried profile looked like, whether it was in a form that would hold up to scrutiny, and he said it was, and she spent the next 3 weeks asking questions. What she learned over the course of those 3 weeks was that the acquiring firm's principal was a man who had made his money in logistics and real estate and had recently begun buying large tracts of Appalachian land under a conservation easement strategy, and that his understanding of the chestnut operation, that what he was buying in his own mind was acreage with a reforestation story attached to it. Not an operation with a buried soil inheritance that had been driving premium yields for 8 years and would drive them for another 25 at minimum. She wrote back to the acquisition firm. She told them the figure of $9 million did not reflect the operation's value. She said she was willing to discuss terms, but that any meaningful conversation would need to account for the documented soil profile, the yield history, and the projected premium crop value over a 30-year horizon. The acquisition firm went quiet for 6 weeks. Then they came back with a different number, and there were lawyers involved by then on both sides. And the process took the better part of a year, and I will not rehearse every turn of it here, because what matters is not the negotiation, but what was underneath it, which was a woman who had read her grandmother's notebook carefully enough to plant trees on the right 50 feet of ground and wait 16 years to find out what the ground remembered, and who knew when the letter came that the value in the land was not what the letter said it was. Her neighbor stopped by in the fall of 2020, after the terms had been worked out, and she had agreed to a conservation easement arrangement that kept the chestnut operation running under her management for a guaranteed term of 22 years with a lease structure and a partial buyout that she said was satisfactory. And he pulled up in his truck for said, which I will say was not particularly clean, and rolled down the window and looked out at the bench where the oldest section of the planting was in full bearing. The canopy closed and heavy with October burrs, and he sat there for a moment, and then he said, without particularly looking at her, that the east section had held up. He said it the way men in those hills say things. They mean more completely than they let on, and she said it had. And he nodded once, and then he said he supposed she'd figured out what the old trees knew, and she said she supposed she had, and he rolled up his window and drove back down the access road. The land doesn't care who believes in it. Her grandmother had written that in the notebook in 1969, in the margin next to a record of a drought year when the county agent had told her the chestnut crop on the ridge would be poor and she'd harvested 8,000 pounds, in spite of him. The land doesn't care who believes in it. It does what it has been building toward at the pace it intends to build, and the only question it puts to a person is whether that person is willing to pay the kind of attention that doesn't ask for immediate returns. She had paid that attention for 16 years on ground that a clipboard had told her was marginal, on ground that a clean truck and a polite, certain voice had looked at and measured against a wrong standard, and the ground had paid it back with interest, not because she had been lucky, but because her grandmother had looked carefully at a spring seep on a September afternoon in 1972 and written down what she noticed, and she had been the person who finally read it. If you have your own piece of ground that knows something you haven't gotten to the bottom of yet, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. There are more notebooks in more drawers than anyone has finished reading, and more ridges with buried ground beneath the spoil than the clipboards have bothered to find. Subscribe if this story meant something to you, and take your time on the good ground. The field will wait.